other main revenue sport in college sports. So it's like, that makes sense. Maybe plant your flag there, and that's how you survive.
And Baylor too. I mean, that's the last 2 national champions of
Exactly.
basketball.
So that makes sense, planting your flag in that regard. But football is obviously still king and the biggest driver, and the ACC has this. Everyone now knows what is it? Grant of rights. We've heard that terminology, and I am curious as to what Sam thinks about that. But Florida State is now in this spot where everyone just like they feel like an SEC team, like Clemson, Florida State, NC State. I think in Miami too, probably feel like the most SEC type schools to move into the SEC out of anyone in the conference. But there's
I'd
also
probably
this
throw Virginia Tech in there too.
Virginia Tech as well. I would be okay with that. But you know what's interesting? I had a Virginia Tech guy on last week, and I didn't realize how many different conferences they've already been in. They've been independent. They've been in the Big East. They've been in the ACC. They were in something else, and I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. But it was something else, and they've just become used to just bouncing around. So like, we don't care. We'll figure it out. Like the attitude in Blacksburg is like, realignment, me alignment. We'll figure it out. We'll be fine. But as a Florida State alum and fan, how nervous are you about the days ahead? Because you don't necessarily have a home, and you might fall out of the Power 2 potentially.
I'm not that nervous long term. I think kind of short term. I mean, depending on how long this goes, how long this drags out for either joining the SEC or the Big Ten, or how long Florida State remains in the ACC. The further away they get from a national title, then, the worry is you don't want to turn into like a Nebraska where, a 18-year-old recruit doesn't remember you ever being good. Mm-hmm. So, and I think they'll have a decent season this year, but I don't know how it's going to take a while for them to get back to, competing for national titles. I think they're definitely at least probably 3 years minimum away from that level. But I think, Florida State, it's a national brand. If you look at whenever they play and, nationally televised games, they, even not being very good, they still do great ratings. So I think it's an attractive school for either the SEC or the Big Ten to potentially add in the coming, next couple years.
That's interesting. We looked at it with the Notre Dame Florida State game. That was a big deal. A lot of folks tuned in. That was really cool. In Tallahassee, like that's become a good game. And you look at it, Florida State, great brand. Obviously, the Bobby Bowden run is now, I think, underrated because folks like it. I think we talked about this last week, Matt. It was just that like his dominance for that 15 to 20 year span is just insane. A lot of people just remember the end, but they're like the records and the numbers and just the 10-win seasons is just preposterous. But the ACC has this weird grant of rights thing that runs through 2036, and you have mystery schools who have reached out about finding ways around this and like having we pay a little bit at a time of how much we owe to get out of this thing. Like, what do you ultimately want to see happen though, Sam? Do you want to see the ACC figure it out, or do you want them to jump ship? Do you want them to get ahead of it, kind of like what UCLA and USC did and getting to the Big Ten? Do you want them to get out as quickly as possible?
I think at this point, probably get out as quickly as possible. I don't really know if there is like a long-term solution for the ACC. Absent, Notre Dame deciding to join the conference, which I don't think is going to happen. Especially they kind of did a trial run a couple years ago with the COVID season where they were in the conference, and it doesn't seem like they had any interest in joining the conference with football after that. So I think for Florida State to make sure that they don't fall too far behind with the arms race where schools they're trying to compete with are making twice as much money a year, I think it's probably better that they find a home in another conference sooner rather than later, because I don't think it's going to work long term in the ACC, and that's not just for Florida State. I think that's for the conference as a whole.
What do you think, Matt?
See, to me, the ACC seems like the most solid of the Big 12, Pac-12, ACC. They just seem to have some of those brands, like we're talking with Florida State, with Miami, Clemson, even Duke and North Carolina in basketball. Like they seem, and obviously this grant of rights thing that, although I'm not convinced that that's really going to keep anyone from jumping ship. It's like money's not real for these people, right? It's like the SEC will pay whatever they need to pay to get whoever they want from the ACC, right? Or ESPN will pay that for the SEC, right? So I'm not convinced. Like there's so many teams in the ACC that do kind of fit jumping in the SEC, like because people have kind of always hinted at Clemson and Florida State, maybe even like a Louisville up there with Kentucky. But I feel like the SEC, you just know they're going to make a sexy move. Like regardless of what they do, like it's going to be sexy. If it's Duke, North Carolina or something, or Florida State and Miami, like they're going to get one of the big time brands. But I'm not necessarily convinced that the ACC is definitely dead. Like with the Pac-12, like the Pac-12 feels like it's on life support, especially if some of these teams jump into the Big 12, like if half the conference joins the Big 12. So I don't know. The ACC, it feels like it's on more solid ground than those other conferences to me.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen, overnight. It might take a while for that to kind of fall apart, but I just don't have a lot of confidence that we'll get to that, 2035, 2036 when that grant of rights is up and you still have the same 14 teams that you currently have in the conference. Because I think at a certain point, schools like Florida State, schools like Clemson, schools like Miami, they're not going to just sit by and let schools in the SEC and the Big Ten make twice as much money as them a year and be okay with that.
Well, I read a really interesting piece. I forgot where it was yesterday that this might be the new model in college football. And this is what might save the ACC is that part of the reason that Clemson and Miami and schools like that, North Carolina, want to leave and are pissed right now is that they've been kind of subsidizing the rest of the conference. So when y'all talk about like the brands in the ACC and like it is a strong conference, Wake Forest is small. Like you go up Syracuse, small. Like you go up and down the list of the schools that they do have. I think where the ACC is in trouble is that there's no question who runs that conference and who brings in the majority of the money for that conference. So without Clemson becoming a superpower, without Miami doing what they do, Florida State doing what they do, and North Carolina doing what they do, they don't make any money. Like they're in trouble. Like if you remove a couple of those schools from the conference, that conference is probably worse than the Mountain West. Like the Sun Belt is stronger in a lot of ways. So I think the way to kind of get them happy is splitting up the revenue where we're not doing this equal revenue amongst each university. The way to save the ACC is just like, hey, we have to be honest about who's bringing the most money, and like Clemson gets the most, and Miami and Florida State, they're right here, and NC State, North Carolina, wherever it is, but like they're not going to subsidize Pitt, Syracuse, and Duke football and stuff like that. It's just that I think is the only way to like start the conversation of getting all those schools on the same page. I hadn't considered that, but that is something interesting because you just don't think that all those schools would get on board with it. But if you're Wake and you're staring at like they don't have a choice. Like schools like Wake are like, well, we kind of need y'all to stay together because we're not getting picked up by the SEC or Big Ten. So if this goes south, Wake is a group of 5, like basically FCS school. Like they drop significantly and they're in like basically like Sunbelt, take us, and we're just in purgatory. So kind of like what happened to SMU when the Southwest Conference closed down in the mid 90s. They were left without a home. Rice was in that conference. People forget. And then when you make that drop and you are no longer in that power conference, the money-making conference, things change on a dime. And it's really, really hard to get back to where you were. Houston's just now getting closer to that. But I don't know. I think that's interesting. What do you think?
I mean, if that SEC can steal Texas from the Big 12, then they can steal North Carolina from the ACC. It's like I feel like that's because I think North Carolina is usually the brand everyone talks about. Like they basically throw their weight around in the ACC. Like they're kind of the king of the hill in the ACC. So I feel like if you can poach Texas and Oklahoma, I feel like you have no problem poaching North Carolina. Like, I don't think long term, like Sam kind of said earlier, like these big brands in the ACC, they're not just gonna look around. It's basically what USCU did. Like, okay, we're better than everyone out here. We're not cool with Northwestern and Rutgers cashing bigger checks than us. That's just not an option. And I think the ACC teams are going to see that. Like, the SEC wants us. Like, we're gonna join the SEC.
Well, the only reason they're okay with it, like the reason the SEC schools are okay with Vanderbilt cashing that huge check, is because they are in the Power 2, where they're cashing obscene checks. So when the money is so crazy, you're like, all right, I guess we'll subsidize Vanderbilt. Like, that's fine, whatever. We're still making an insane amount of money. But when you're not, and you're looking at the graph and you're looking at the numbers and you're like, we're making a third of what the Big Ten and the SEC are projected to make, like, that's a problem. And if you want us to stick together and be loyal for you guys, then like, you're going to have to split this up, and we're going to have some tough, honest conversations about who's valuable and who's not. It's interesting you throw North Carolina out, because everything I've seen is just like if they were to expand into the North Carolina market, the SEC that is, it would not be North Carolina. It would be NC State. And part of that is we got to think about the academics aspect of this. So the Big Ten, I think part of the reason Notre Dame would not go to the SEC and they would prioritize the Big Ten is just there is a lot of state schools, obviously, in the Big Ten, and that's kind of where they started things. But it seems like they are going to prioritize that more. And I think North Carolina's academic standards would push them more to the Big Ten than the SEC. I don't know. It seems like that would be how it goes. If they do expand, North Carolina will end up in the Big Ten and not, and NC State would end up in the SEC.
I could see that. It's like kind of like A&M. Like, you couldn't take Texas from the jump, so you took Texas A&M to get into the state of Texas. Like, maybe you can't get North Carolina, so you get NC State, which is another obviously huge
quarterback.
Brand.
People forget
for sure.
Devin Leary, Phillip Rivers, Ryan Finley. Sam, that's a thing. Like in NC State,
Mike Glennon.
Mike Glennon.
Is that his name?
It's Mike Glennon. I think he's still cashing some NFL checks. Shout out to Mike.